David Keller, Chair of the Department of Kinesiology. I welcome you all to our 57th Texas ACSM Department of Kinesiology research lecture. The presenters of this lecture are effectively a who's who in exercise physiology over the last really 3 decades, at least going back about that far. And today's lecture, Dr. Peter Raven is currently at the UNT Health Science Center in Fort Worth in the Department of Integrated Physiology and Anatomy. Dr. Raven got his PhD from the University of Oregon. He did a postdoctoral fellowship at UC Santa Barbara. He came to the Metroplex in the mid-70s, very good decade, so I'm told. In 74, he spent time working with Steve Blair and Steve Cooper before joining TCOM in 1977, which is now the UNT Health Science Center Fort Worth. Dr. Raven has a rich history both in basic and clinical science, in physical activity, pulmonary physiology, and over the last few decades contributed as much as anyone in the world to our understanding of dynamic blood pressure regulation, neural control, and vasculature as it relates to blood pressure control. He's got over 175 peer-reviewed publications, has had funding from a variety of federal sources, has published an exercise physiology book, and been a great mentor to many previous students and postdocs. So if everyone will, please welcome Dr. Peter Raven.
It's a great pleasure to be back and speaking to you again. What Dr. Keller didn't tell you is that the topic of this is the history of exercise physiology and where it was founded, etc. So I've got a lot of slides, so we'll entertain questions at the end, but I think you'll see there's a very rich history that's come out of PE. My PhD degree is in health, physical education, and recreation, but it's very much gone into the science of exercise, and ACSM now claims that exercise is medicine, but you will see very early on in the 1900s that exercise is medicine is the foundation of exercise physiology. So I just wanted to give you a little touch of where physiology started, and physiology's university laboratory in 1882 in a university founded at the University of Oxford in 1264. The other one that's very influential is the University of Copenhagen, and we go there every year to give a postdoctoral training course for 1 week solid, but you have all the world's leaders other than myself coming there under the invitation of, unfortunately, the recently deceased Saltine. Harvard Fatigue Laboratory is also a major effort in this country, and it's 1927 is when that started. And we're the young guns down here are UT Southwestern that have a tremendous history. They started in the 50s. And of course, we founded the Texas chapter of American College of Sports Medicine, and it's the only single state chapter and there's 13 chapters for the annual meeting. And then we've got us sitting over here in the Mayo Clinic, are all sort of hooked into this whole genre of exercise physiology. Where are we? So I wanted to go to that one. Oh, sorry, I went too far on that one. I'm just, there we go, I got it. So here in Copenhagen is where a lot of this is where exercise physiology really started. What you have here is the Rijks Hospital, which is the national hospital. Liver transplants, cardiac transplants, you'll notice the thing there. These are the lakes that are very similar. You can walk the city of Copenhagen in half a day or a day. and I'll give you a little bit of history of that as well. But the Krogh Institute is over here, and this is the Panem, which is the medical school, and this whole area. And this is where a lot of the exercise physiology founders were sort of doing their research starting in the 1900s. I have to do it this way. Okay. So just to give you a quick look at who are the people involved, Panem, the Panem Institute, which I just showed you, came from Germany and brought with him Christian Bohr. Christian Bohr, they basically are the founders of exercise physiology. The Bohr effect, I think you all know, is that rightward shift of the oxyhemoglobin curve, which allows a thing. And Christian Bohr was the father of Niels Bohr, which is the atomic theory and quantum mechanics. And then his students were what really made him sort of fundamental to exercise physiology was August Krogh and Karl Hasselbalch. Henderson was the founder of the Harvard Fatigue Lab, and David Bruce Dill was the actual director of the Fatigue Lab. But the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation also shows you a lot to do with acid-base balance during exercise. So you can see that around the turn of the century in the 1900s is where exercise physiology started. I've got to do it this way. Yeah. So August Krogh, student of exercise physiology, and Johannes Lindhard are the two people that really founded. Lindhard was a physician, a general practitioner physician, but he was very interested in exercise. The Turnvereins in Germany, and he was a student of Hasselbalch's, and he introduced exercise physiology to the zoophysiologist, August Krogh, who won the Nobel Prize for capillary recruitment in 1920, meaning that when exercise started to contract, they recruited more and more capillaries so that the blood flow into the muscle could be expanded. Unfortunately, he made the decision that started at the beginning of exercise, where two people at Kansas State University, David Poole and Tim Mush, have shown that not to be accurate. So even though the Nobel Prize was awarded, there's always a question, especially when technology increases your understanding of what's going on. The three main people that came from Krogh is Erik Høye Christensen, Erling Asmussen, and Marius Nielsen, and they're called the Three Musketeers. They came from the University of Copenhagen. Notice they were in there, and about when World War II started, they all three left Denmark because the Germans were coming in, and they left and went to neutral Sweden. And the Karolinska Institute became the next center of exercise physiology. So let me go back. I got it. So early on, there were no measurements of how much blood was being pumped by the heart. No direct measurements, no indirect measurements. But in the early 1900s, a German called Grollmann used a acetylene rebreathe cardiac output technique. That's soluble in blood, and by measuring across the artery and the vein, you knew how much was being taken up, and you could calculate the cardiac output. The problem with it was they used 20% acetylene. 20% acetylene is what a welder uses. It's very explosive. So the Danes, or Krogh and Lindhard, developed the nitrous oxide rebreathe technique, which is very, very sort of innocuous, except that if you have too much nitric oxide, of course, you feel a little loopy. But the other thing that the link now, I'm going to give you the link to Texas, is that the acetylene rebreathe technique was developed at UT Southwestern with Gunnar Blomqvist and R.L. Johnson. There was some controversies that went on for years between the Danes and even the father of August Krogh, Christian Bohr, but these were people out of Oxford. They believed in the secretion of gases at the lung and tissues. But Marie Krogh developed a diffusion technique which identified that gases were diffusing across the lung. And so it was amazing if you read the history of how they sort of went through these huge arguments. I mean, they were calling each other fools and silly stuff like that. But Christensen left Denmark, as I said, in Sweden just before the Germans invaded Denmark. He never published. Germany was the sort of base of where physiology started. Animal and human physiology started, in the Western world anyway. And he never published a paper in German. He only published in Danish or English. So and then the next big name that comes along, notice it's at the Karolinska in Stockholm, P.O. Åstrand, who was there. He worked with Christensen. He got his PhD with Christensen before entering the medical school at Karolinska, received his MD degree in PhD. And most of the leaders of this ilk were MDs. They were Danish or Swedish MDs. The big one that really became very, very a leader in the world is Saltine, and he just passed away September 12th, 2014. But notice he got his PhD in 64. Between 60 and 64, he'd already published 15 peer-reviewed manuscripts in JAP, Journal of Applied Physiology. Main focus at that time was dilution cardiac output responses to exercise and temperature regulation. He subsequently went into muscle physiology. And that's Bengt cycling on the original Monarch bicycle. And this is Åstrand, Bengt being tested. And then this is Irma Reiming, who then got married to Åstrand. Not after this test, but got married to Åstrand in his career. And you'll see Åstrand and Åstrand nomogram, or the Reiming Åstrand nomogram, which predicts from submaximal heart rate and workload the VO2 max. And it's still a very, very acceptable way of predicting VO2 max. Saltine in 64 and 67 met Carlton Chapman. Chapman at Southwestern in Dallas. He was a cardiologist. He went over and recruited Bengt Saltine and Gunnar Blomqvist, who was a Swede that had arrived, that was at the Karolinska at the time. And he joined Jerry Mitchell in Dallas to be members of a new investigative team, Response and Adaptations to Exercise. And that was continually funded for Jerry Mitchell over 40 plus years as the successor to Chapman. Chapman was chief of medicine. Jerry became a professor in cardiology. And he's a Longview, Texas boy, and he loves Texas. And he married a blue blood New Englander and brought her down here to Texas. And they stayed for the rest of for her life anyway. She just passed away about 3 years ago. Oh, sorry. Don't beat me. Okay. All right, so notice that the star of the US flag is above the Danish flag, but notice if I'm talking in Denmark, I turn the slide up the other way. and show that Denmark's on top of the Americans. So, is that gone? There we go. So just give you a concept of what Denmark is like. This is Texas, obviously. Look at the population, 25 million. Now, this is about 5 years ago. Population in the Metroplex, 6.4 million, basically. Denmark's total population, 5 million, 5.5 million people. Copenhagen's 2 million people. But the impact that the Denmark scientists have had on exercise physiology is absolutely huge. And I think I'll be able to give you that concept. Denmark goes into Texas 16 times. UK goes into Texas 6 times. So you can see the magnitude. This is Carlton Chapman, and this is Jerry Mitchell. Jerry Mitchell is, you'll hear that name quite often if you ever read exercise physiology and exercise pressor reflex and central command. We'll talk about that a little bit. So where are we? Did that go forward? Would you do it? Yeah. Now the big study that Chapman did was a Bedrest study. And he had Mitchell and Saltine, this is Saltine, training the subjects after they'd been to bed for 21 days. So it was the start of two big things that came out of that study. Okay, so there's the data of the bed rest. Notice what happens. They did their maximal VO2 test, put them to bed for 21 days, and you saw the decline in VO2. To get back to that, or increase to get back to the level of, here's the more VO2 max, the bigger they fell. And to get back to that training level, it took approximately 50 to 60 days. And this was boot camp type training that Saltine led. Saltine himself was an international orienteer, and he loved to run and put people get into pain. So, can I get that? So what was the impact? Well, the impact was when you had a heart attack, the doctors recommended in the 50s, go to bed. In the 60s, go to bed. Don't do too much effort. Don't exercise. There was no such thing as cardiac rehab. This is what happened, because here, tremendous atrophy, cardiac and skeletal muscle atrophy, and it supported the early ambulation post-MI and any invasive surgery. Even if you had an invasive surgery, they would put you to bed following it instead of getting you up walking right away. Now it's routine. Get them up as early as you can. You don't need pulmonary embolisms. You don't need this. So this was the start of cardiac rehab, and it also provided the fundamental knowledge for the Bedrest studies that were having to be carried out in the 60s and 70s and 80s for the space flights, to understand what was going on up in space, because it's total deconditioning in space unless they do certain types of exercise. Next. And just to emphasize that, this is the rate of decline of that Bedrest study, 0.25 liters per kg per minute per year, whereas the rate of decline in a cross-sectional study of aging is 0.4 mils per kg per minute per year. So much faster, and the slope of the athletes detraining over a period of 50 years or 30 years is 1.4 mils per kg per minute per year. So the bigger you are, the faster you fall. So, next slide. Saltine returned to the Karolinska as an assistant professor and associate professor. Conscious decision he did in the 60s, besides his cardiovascular work, he then took it to skeletal muscle and worked with Bergstrom. Bergstrom was the one that developed the muscle biopsy technique. All of these are leading people that have used the muscle biopsy technique or animal studies to examine what goes on with skeletal muscle during training and detraining. Exercise training, enzymes, and the fiber types of power and endurance athletes. He also did the major biopsy, muscle biopsies. He's doing the triceps here, and then we can do the next one, and show you the distribution of the slow twitch fibers of sprinters and power athletes. Notice about a very small amount here, the middle distance runners and the power athletes, the middle distance runners and the long distance runners. And the slow twitch fibers are the type 1 fiber, the red fiber in the muscle. And people like some of the marathoners or the ultra distance runners have 90 to 100% slow twitch. Now slow twitch doesn't mean that they run slow. Some of these guys are running, 5 or 6 minute per marathon times. 2 hours, 9 minutes is darn near 5-minute miles. So if you can run 5-minute miles, maybe you've got a certain amount of red fiber. But he joined his interest from 67 to 73. Look, he worked with all these people. They're all leaders of the world. Between 67, he published 79 peer-reviewed papers, 11 per year. Now, he was the major author on these. He wasn't a secondary author. He was the major author. So see what his work production is. Next slide. In 1970, Krogh Institute was founded, and Asmund became directors. But Nielsen fell ill, and so Saltine was recruited back from the Karolinska to become professor of human physiology. And all that work, he published 112 papers, 7 per year, and he developed a huge number of collaborations worldwide. And it was still with the Mitchell and Saltine were still friends and still going and went on until he died. Mitchell and Saltine were colleagues for 50 years. Next slide. In 1970, or 1980s, we used to think the amount of blood flow, maximal blood flow, was about 4 mils per kg based on frog muscle. Stainsby did some work in Florida on using that. Saltine didn't believe that, and they developed a method of measuring isolating the muscle, the quadriceps muscle, and then thermal dilution blood flow measurement in the femoral vein, which is a cardiac output method. Thermal dilution blood flow measurement is a cardiac output method used in routine surgeries every time now by the cardiology groups and the cardiovascular people. And he identified that next. There was the muscle blood flow in humans, 250 mils per kg per minute. Skeletal muscle VO2 max are 350 mils of AT2. That was nearly 300 times what they thought it was way back. So if you read a book before 1970, you're going to have a terrible idea of what muscle blood flow is. Next slide. And then they demonstrated that the ultrasound technology of measuring blood flow was linearly related to the thermal dilution method, and so this has become more of a routine method. This is a very complex methodology. This one is, because you've got the ultrasound scope, you can just go in and measure the blood flow right away. Next slide. The CMRC, the Copenhagen Muscle Research Center, started in 1994 and they only were funding them for 2 years, for 2 5-year periods. The Danish Academy of Research Foundation. And if you examine what's going on here, they $3.5 million per 5 years, but they had no salary costs because it's a national system and the salaries are all hooked into the medical field, what hospital they're at, and it's all national healthcare system. So anesthesia, Peterson, infectious diseases, these are huge names in our field. Main focus, skeletal muscle, diabetes, neuropathies, inflammation, all of these things. And in 2000, there were 9 professors, Saltine, Secker, Galbo, Peterson. These, again, you go through the history of exercise physiology, and they're all in Copenhagen. They're not spread around the world. They had a specific growth and differentiation of muscle, metabolism of carbohydrates and fats. All of this, they identified myokines. Bender Peterson, Carlin Peterson identified myokines and showed that the muscle was an endocrine organ. So a new concept way in the 90s. The muscle is an endocrine organ, and it can act autocrine, paracrine, or endocrine. But he still kept his interest in cardiovascular regulation, VO2, and mitochondrial regulation. So next slide. So there's the Copenhagen Muscle Research Center. These are the avenues that they examined, and you'll see biopsies. I'll show you a few more things. And it's now closed. It doesn't have that anymore. It doesn't have a continuation. They have other institutes or muscle centers. But this one is closed, and they've spun off about 5 other centers at the same time. Next slide. And just to show you the type of investigation that Saltine developed, the ultrasound methods, and you'll see that there's dialysis tubes. Can we get the next slide? See